Good morning, everybody. Can you hear us okay? Hopefully you can. If you could go ahead and just type in the chat window and make sure that you guys can all hear us, that would be fabulous. My name is Michelle Long, and I'm the owner of Long for Success. I'd like to thank you for being with us today. And yep, they say they can hear us. Very good. Thank you, Linda, for confirming that. I appreciate it. Again, I'm Michelle Long with Long for Success. Thank you for being here, and I really appreciate Chuck donating and volunteering his time to help you all learn more about some of this. Today he's talking about inventory management. And Chuck, you want to go ahead and take it away?
All right, let's try this again. Objectives. Available cube information, the reporting types, QuickBooks odds and ends, trying to give you some tips and tricks and let you know what QuickBooks does and what they don't expose and underneath the hood, just a few items. And we're actually going to create some reports today or some analysis, things that you can probably use. All right. So in terms of the available information, and there's only a couple slides available here. It's not, I don't go through a lot, but the beginning is kind of my blah, blah, blah portion, and then we actually kind of dig in. But in terms of what's available in an inventory subject, remember subject in Cube is something that it's a logical grouping of information, right? And it allows you to say, I want to analyze inventory. Well, it has all the pieces, right? You don't have to link a sales subject and a purchasing subject. Everything inside inventory is complete, right? You don't have to do anything else to it. So obviously the transaction information is that you have the historical sales in your purchases, right? The assemblies, whether they're built, whether they're pending. You've got transfers, you've got adjustments, and then of course you've got your open sales orders and your open purchase orders, right? All the information that could happen within QuickBooks that affect the item. Estimates were not a part of this. Estimates typically are not part of any inventory management system. Estimates generally are reserved for job costing, right? Then, of course, we have all the list information, and we're talking today about Powerpivot, right? Powerpivot, and you can see it at the top right. That's where we have the database that sits inside Excel, right? That's what Powerpivot is by Excel. They have an instance of SQL Server inside. Webinar Wednesdays, this being the fourth one out of 5, and the first 2 we did the basic and we did the advanced, and so I'm not going to go through the details of how to operate that. But just know that this is what we're going to focus on. And of course we have all of the advanced inventory information, the serial numbers, the lot numbers, et cetera, et cetera. And you're going to see how much easier it is to do that in the pivot table than it is to run some report when you're inside QuickBooks. Right? In terms of report pieces, as I call them, or report types, this would be the biggest one. This is an analysis of, what do I have on hand, and I'd like to see the details of our open sales orders and purchase orders and when things are going to be due. This is one type of report. A second type of report is that I want to use this to actually manage my inventory in terms of ordering. What do I do to order, right? You set up these big spreadsheets and you got to figure out multipliers and what's my average sales and how much sales do I need to have on hand, how much do I anticipate, if the stuff's coming from China, how do I affect all this? Typically you see some really, really large, incredible spreadsheets. So we're going to show you some of that today. And then, of course, secondary, right, the ability just to manipulate your data in a lot of ways. You may want to look at it by serial lot number, maybe the age of an item. I'm going to discuss that a little bit. Even by vendor, and you're going to see what is the limitation that QuickBooks gives us on that one. That is a difficult one, as you'll see. So those kind of the 3 different types. One is, again, the looking at what is due and when something is going to come in. And then the second one is how do I order information, and looking at sales and what's open and what I anticipate. And the third one is just the ability to analyze your information a different way. Okay. And then lastly, we will get to the QB odds and ends. I will discuss some of this, but we'll come back to this portion here, okay, on the odds and ends. First thing I want to do is kind of show, we looked at the report pieces. Let's just for a moment go into some things that we used to have to do actually in Crystal. Some of what we're doing today in some sense is new. Since Powerpivot has come out, it has put the power of being able to create these types of reports in Excel. Before, there was almost no way we could do it. You almost always had to use Crystal, and of course that took it out of the end user's hands to be able to create. And that's something that saddened me for a long time, because I'm going, somebody comes and they go, well, I want to do this report. And part of the problem is that when you run a report inside QuickBooks, you're running summary information, okay? And most people want a combination of summary plus they want some detail. The problem is when you're in QuickBooks, you have to kind of drill down and then look at and then see what's here. It's really kind of kludgy, to be honest, especially working with, you know, thousands of items. This just becomes a bear. You can't look at it at one glance. And that's because people want to be able to include detailed information as well as summary information. Well, when you're working with any kind of database system, you work with one or the other, typically. Now, great thing is that what you're going to be able to see here using Excel is that you can have summary information because the pivot table automatically summarizes information. Plus, you'll have the details like open sales orders and open purchase orders and when they're due. Okay. These are, I'm just going to show you a few examples. These are things that we would typically say have to do in like Crystal. Now, you can see that this is just like a huge bear here. Let's make this a little bit bigger. And you can see all the information. They have all this historical sales they want to look at, you know, on a month-by-month basis. You know, they have the averages, the weekly averages. And you know what? This first part over here, okay, where it has the historical sales for time periods, I don't think I've seen two people look at it the same way. Everybody has a different way that they, you know, think is important to them as to how they, you know, view what the trends are. And unfortunately, you know, the larger the company you are and the more inventory items you have to become more like Henry Ford to automate this as much as possible. When you're small, you do a lot of manual intervention. And you say, well, this item is going to be up this much, but I want to massage the data, right? You're always trying to, you know, figure out what is the best thing. But as you get larger, that becomes more difficult and time-consuming. I mean, think about it. You know, obviously Walmart is not going to be in QuickBooks, but when you look at their size, I mean, that's all Henry Ford. Everything is automated, right? They have the trends. Things are calculated automatically. They can tell you what's off the shelf in almost real time. So, you know, for small businesses, you try and get away from the manual thought process in terms of your inventory and more of a manual eyeball process to make sure that something is just really not out of line, right? You've been running a business and you have a pretty good idea. So anyway, this is just one kind of an example where you can see they have these forecasts and they're looking at what time periods, what is going to be on there. And, you know, you talk with these people and you know, sometimes you say, well, it might be a better way. Yeah, they have the way that they've been doing this for a while. That's one. Let's look at this. Again, I'm just trying to show you different types. Here's one that's really totally different. Here's a bakery. Right? Now, you can't do these types of things. Now, this one here you could never do in Excel in a million years. But, again, you can see what people use to be able to forecast their inventory. And in this case, we have all the pieces, so it makes it easier to do. When we used to do these in like the old QADBC driver or whatever method was available through QuickBooks, it just was virtually impossible. These things took us so long to do. This one still takes a while, but at least the information is easier to get to. Let me see, maybe one more example here. So again, this is a recap, kind of like the first type that you saw. Again on hand, and then they have different ways that they look at their sales history. In this one, they say, well, they actually have a reorder now column. We're actually going to create something that's pretty close to this today, because this is more typical of what people tend to ask for in this particular arena. And then lastly, the one I want to show you, interesting one here. This has the details, but this is one that's by lot number. And what they wanted to do is they wanted to see what is the receive date of a lot number. They wanted to see the age of something. And so this is kind of the details for everything for like this particular lot number. So again, all different ways that people do this. You know, as we always say, 15,000 reports and we still don't have the two that are like, excuse me, and you're going to find this out with your clients. They all have a different way. What do? You always start with a picture, right? You never ever just start out with somebody says. If I say sofa or chair rather, you know, you might think blue sofa and he might be thinking bar stool. You don't know. So a picture always becomes your scope and it becomes the definition of what you're going to try and accomplish. All right. Okay. So let's move on from this one here. Okay, come on. There we go. All right, so I had posted it all the Excel example that we're using today. I made a smaller example for you guys that you can play along with if you want to use, and you know, you don't need Cube to do this, right? You can just have this to play with and just you know, see how it works. So we kind of start out, right? We always have pre-built example, so to speak, and this is just something we started out with. But what I want to do is kind of get rid of some of this. Well, actually, before I do that, before I get rid of some of that, let's look at how the data is organized in here. And if you would, you know, we have these different views of the information. One called default perspective, that's kind of the grand kahuna that's got most everything in here. And remember that there's a version of SQL Server, right? Just to recap, you look at the Powerpivot window here. In a Powerpivot window is actually a view into the SQL Server. This is sitting on top of the SQL Server. You guys don't even know it's installed, right? That's what Powerpivot is. And you can see that we have all these different tabs. We have tabs about the inventory details or about the item, right? These are all different fields that came from Cube that are updated automatically. And again, I don't want to dwell so much on that part. Just the fact that this is the information. It's sitting in SQL Server. That's why you can do millions of rows so quickly. And inventory, you need that kind of power. I would never ever do inventory forecasting in the regular pivot table. It's just almost impossible. It is impossible. You can't do any if statements or for, you know, like history in terms of that. Okay, so that was just the recap on that one. So basically we know that we're measuring things, right? If you remember that. Values are things that you measure, and measure things like quantity and amount, right? And it could be a sum, it could be an average, right? It could be an average rate, but values, right? And then the labels are things that you measure by, right? In this case, we're measuring something by item, document forecast. You don't know what that is yet. I'm going to explain that. In fact, let's just take that out. Let's just take the document forecast out, and I'm going to take the forecast date out for the moment, right? So all we're doing is we're measuring, right, quantity, in this case a sum, by this particular item, right? And I might bring in a lot number, and I might do item then lot number, right? So it's just a measure. That's all you're doing. You just the way that you want to look at your particular data, right? We have certain filters in this report. Now, what I did here is that I actually include the ability to look at non-inventory items, because I know there are times that most of us would like to be able to, even though QuickBooks doesn't do it, a lot of times we would like to do that in terms of ordering. And so I included that there. So the item type, you really would like to be able to filter by, in this case, inventory and inventory assembly, right? That's how QuickBooks tracks of it, particularly for cost, right? It's the only way you can track those types of cost. And then you're going to see I have a couple other filters, and I'm going to explain this. This is the PO status, and I will get back into that in a second. And of course the slices, right? The slices are filters, right, that just allow you to quickly look at an item in real time. Right? Instead of having 55,000 items, you can just look at a particular item, or if you wanted to look at a particular lot number, you know, if we had the more details here, you could just click on something to see what that lot number would do. So that's all that slices are. So let's get rid of the slicer that says serial and lot number here. Let's just use the item. And let's look at how the data is laid out. If you remember a few minutes ago, I had discussed that you have all of the document details, right? In the business analysis world, the business intelligence world, they call those fact tables, right? Or facts, however you want to call them. You know, that's all the details, that your transaction details. All these other pieces that you see in here are, you know, different pieces of the list, right? Whether it's the custom fields for the item, how they're grouped, maybe information about the item, the purchase cost, you know, or whether it's taxable. These are ways that you can measure your information inside the subject, right? So inventory details, which is in caps, that contains all of the factual transactional information. So let's see how that's laid out. So the first thing you'll notice here at the top is that we have document information, right? And you can see we have document type, the document reference number. We've got some stuff in here that you're going to go, what is this? Document category and forecast type. I'm going to explain those in a second. You'll see what I mean by those, okay? But you have the document which refers to, this reference number is the same for the document regardless of the number of lines that you had on that transaction. So we have a document, then we get to the line information. This is the details. And you're probably not going to find this anywhere else. We made great pains to make this easy to filter something or look at a piece of data without having to write a ton of lines of code. This goes against the grain of what I would say is typical data warehousing. Maybe not totally, but to some degree it does. Because people are always worried about, you know, the room that it takes up, and in this day and age, not as big a concern, right? So you'll notice that on the line that we have lines that refer to the type of transaction, so to speak, right? So remember I said we had the adjustment, cost of goods sold. We have information about the bills, and we have about consumption. I'm going to come back to that one. Consumption and forecast, you're going to go, what are those? I will explain that. Your inventory and quantity and valuation are really what is on hand, okay? Then you're going to say, well, how? I don't understand that. Okay, that's okay. I'll come back to it. Okay, we have the custom fields. We have the pending bills information. We have information about all the purchase orders, right, whether open or the original amount. We have information about sales types of amounts or quantities. We have the sales order. And then, of course, we have the transfer amounts and quantity. So they're kind of grouped. In other words, you could pull any one of these into your report, and you would be able to see information just about that type of transaction. So, for instance, let's go back to, you're going to say, well, how come I only see summary here? So how did you come up with this 220? Well, let's look at how we might have come up with that. If I take this inventory document type here, and I drag this under my row labels, now we see that we have more detail, right? Make this just a little bit larger. So you can see that these are the various ins and outs of the inventory. And if I were to collapse this, right, we actually have summary information, right? Just like you might get in a QuickBooks, stock status report. But the additional thing here is that you can drill down to the details here. Then you go, I don't want to see, 1,000 lines of bills and checks and things like that. So what we did is that we actually added a couple other qualifiers that make it easier to not have to see all those pieces of data in there. Okay. So we have two things in here. We have another one called inventory document category, and we have another one called forecast type. I'm going to bring in the document category next. I'm going to bring that underneath the inventory document type. Now, when we bring this in, the Powerpivot automatically wants to sum this. So let's take off our subtotals. So now you see that we have a further grouping, right? Because now I can say, okay, bill and check really are part of the purchasing portion for history. Invoice is part of sales, and we got sales orders. So I'm going to switch the order of these things. And you see now that instead of having to look at each detail for bill and check, I can just, this is document type. What if I brought in the transaction date? Okay, let's go over to calendar. Actually, never mind the transaction date. Let's just bring in a reference number, or transaction number would be better. Bring in a transaction number and bring that in at the bottom, right below document type over there. Now you really see how your list can be long, right, when you drill down. You really don't care about a lot of this whole stuff. What you're really trying to get is, I want to see what's on hand and what I have for sales order. And I'm kind of getting into progression. I'm kind of getting to the end result. But I'm just showing you these three fields because they do help you manipulate your data for drill down purposes. So now, rather than have to look at all the details of the bills, well, I could say, well, gee, Chuck, I will summarize bill and check, but I still have two lines that I really don't want to see. So I can go to purchases, and now I can say, well, I can just summarize that, summarize my sales, and now I have, you know, my history of inventory, purchases, and sales. Well, even that could get out of hand, right? You got 10,000, 20,000 items. It's still going to be a long way. So, just for you, we put in one more field, and it's called a forecast type. And this is what's going to make your life easier, and is going to allow you to be able to produce the typical number 2 report. When I showed on the slide, number 2, which number 1, rather, excuse me, number 1, where you get to show the forecast in a detail. This is going to allow you to do that. Take this forecast type. I want you to bring this under the transaction, let me see, no, bring it under transaction document, no, I know what, right after item name, I'm sorry. Now, some of you, if the light bulb may go off here on this one. Now, guess what? I have a field that tells me what's on hand instead of having to see these three things. And those were put because I didn't want to see all the detail of the history. I could care less, right? So if we summarize this, guess what? I can go to on hand. And now, what do I have? I have something that tells me what's on hand. I also have the details of the sales orders, right? That tells me what is on hand, okay? Now, again, you went back to QuickBooks, you would not be able to do that type of report because this is summary. If you want to see the particular sales orders, you have to drill down, you have to go back, and you have to see here. And not only that, you'd have to add the other field that says, well, what is the ship date on this? This is the transaction date. So this gives you the ability to show your information. I'm going to make this a little bit smaller again. Okay. So now I can look at each item and tell you what we'll do here. We shall expand. Let's see if I can show this a little bit better here. Okay. So now for each document category here, let's take. I'm going to take out the document category and the document type for a second, make this less confusing, and take out the transaction number. So now you see very simply, I've got things categorized. I've got on hand, I've got a pending, right, because we have a pending bills quantity, and then I've got purchase order and sales orders. So the in hand, all of the details are hidden underneath, right? If I bring in this transaction number again, and tell you what, take out the transaction number, put in the reference number, and if for anybody that forgot about what is the difference, what's the difference between those two? Okay. All right, you go to Customize Report, you have a transaction number, right, and then you have the reference number, which is the num column over here. Right? For those that you may have forgotten, the transaction number is unique across all transactions in QuickBooks and is always there, something that QuickBooks uses. You don't control that number. Right? And I've pointed out that there are times where people just don't even put a reference number for a bill. So if you put in a reference number, it groups it by the blank reference number. It's kind of hard to tell what is the actual item that you're looking for. So I use transaction number as a fail-safe, but in this case, we're going to use a reference number. All right. It's doing an auto-save. So now notice that we have on hand, we have pending, and we have sales order, and we also have a document reference number that tells us, you know, which specific sales order. Let's look at this doorknob standard just for a moment. Let me see if I can actually, I want to find one that's got sales orders and purchase order. Let's look at its exterior. So I'm going to use this slicer over here. Let's just look at this one item. Let's make it simpler. So now notice that we have on hand, we know we have 16 on hand, and then we also have on open purchase order these two items here. And then you can also notice that we have sales orders. And then we have the open quantity, right? This is open sales orders. So from this, we could arrive at what we call an actual on hand, so to speak. But the problem is it's when that stuff is due, right? You know, that's the real key. I mean, just having this here doesn't really tell us much. Okay? Now, to the right of this, you're going to see something called a forecast quantity. So this is what we call an Uncle Chuckism. Created this field specifically to combine open purchase orders and open sales orders. And this makes it convenient, as you'll see in a couple minutes, to group your data. Okay, it's just, again, you're trying to make things simple in a PowerPivot world or a reporting world. So this is a combination. Forecast quantity is nothing more than open quantity for sales order and open purchase order. Now, if we want to know when this is due, right, having a document reference number, you really want to know when this is due, right? So typically we might do something like the following, right? We know that for a purchase order, there's an expected date. So if we go up to the calendar where we have expected date, now let's drag the expected date down here, down to the row labels here, right at the bottom. And where it's subtotaled at the document reference number, I'm just going to right-click and I'm going to take off the subtotals. Now, curious here, we have expected date for the purchase order, but for the sales order, it says 105/1980. Well, you're probably wondering why it's there. Why is that not blank? That has to do with database management, right? If you have a field that is a date field, you can't put something that's not a date in there. Now, typically you could pull what we call a null value, but it just doesn't work. It doesn't play well. Excel doesn't particularly like to work with null values in a date. So we actually put a date. This 105/5/1980 is internally that says we know this represents a sales order, expected date for the sales order. If you don't want to see that, the great thing about a pivot table is that I can press the space bar to get rid of this. And now you'll see that it gets rid of all instances of 1980, right? So I don't even have to look at it. If I were to make this a little bit smaller, and let's take this filter off for a second, you can see this is going to be true for all expected dates on a sales order. You see that none of these, right? They're all gone. The only thing that's remaining are expected dates for a particular purchase order. So let's go back to exterior on the slicer. Now, we also want the ship date for a sales order, right? That's the other, right? You want to forecast and you want to see when something is due. You need a bucket for it, right? So we're going to go to the ship date. And we're going to drag the ship date below the expected date. And again, it wants the subtotal. Let's right-click here. Let's take off the subtotal. And conversely, purchase orders have this, out of the air, so to speak, ship date of 1980. If I hit the space bar and hit enter, it'll get rid of those instances of 1980. So now we have buckets for sales orders and buckets for purchase orders, right? And again, if I were to take off this filter here, we would see now we have ship dates for the open sales orders, and then we have expected dates for the open purchase orders. So now we're kind of going in the right direction. You may be able to see where we're going with this, okay? But guess what Uncle Chuck did? Uncle Chuck put in something for you called a forecast date. And what do you think that might be? If we have forecast quantity that is a combination of open PO and open quantity, then it might go to reason that forecast date is going to be a combination of the expected date and the ship date. So let's see if that's true. Let's bring the forecast date in. Again, Excel wants to turn this into subtotal. We're going to right-click, take off the subtotal here. So notice that this forecast date, let's go back, let's make this simpler. Let's go back to the exterior. So now we see that this forecast date, just as we had with the forecast quantity made a bucket, one bucket for the open PO and the open sales orders. This forecast date is one bucket that combines expected date and ship date. Now we're going to be able to see the power of what the pivot table can do for us in this aspect, okay? So here's what I would like for you to do. I want to get rid of this pending bills quantity here for a second. And instead of, you see we have open PO, open quantity, sales order quantity, and forecast quantity. Get rid of the open PO and get rid of the open quantity. And then get rid of the inventory amount here. And we can get rid of the expected date. We can get rid of the ship date. So now we've been able to simplify, right? We have fewer columns to mess with, and it's easier to see something, right, as to when something is due, right, if I take off this filter. But we're not done yet. You know, again, I always feel like Ron Popeil with a ginseng knife and the bamboo steamer, and there's more. Okay. So again, we can see the details while also having the summary. On hand, 220. We have, I'm going to get rid of the pending just for a second. I'm going to go to this filter, take away the pending. Again, just to simplify. So we have on hand, and we have the sales order. On hand, purchase order, and the sales order. This is when it's due. But it's really hard to look at this because you're going, well, if I filter by forecast date, what's going to happen? It's going to filter out all the data, and all of a sudden your information is going to be correct. Right? You really don't want to filter by that. What you want to do is you want to view by that date. So I'm going to take this forecast date, and I want to drag it up in the column labels area. You can do it underneath the values here. Now you're going to see all these columns. So what I want you to do with anything that's this inventory quantity here, I just want you to take this and I want you to just hide it for the moment, or everything except the actual inventory and quantity. Just want you to hide this. And now you'll see what it's done is that it's actually put this into buckets. It tells you what date things are expected, okay? So you could look at this particular date and you can see that on this date, these items, this sales order is due to go out the door, date to be shipped, so you can kind of get a feel for what's going to be happen in the future. Now, another way that people do this, okay, rather than forecast date, I'm going to take this out. Might be able to do this a different way. I might be able to say I want the week end date, the forecast week end date. Take that and bring that into your column labels. So now it tells you what's going to happen during a particular week period, right? I could also take that week end date and just pull it into a slicer. And guess what? I could get rid of this in the column labels area, right? We did all this hiding before, right? We really don't need to hide this anymore. Now I can just click on a particular week ending date and it tells me what's due. Now, how easy is that, right? Just a better way, just an easier way of manipulating the data. Now, this is a lot to take in the short time that we've done this, okay? But again, it's recorded, so you'll be able to go back and look at it. So, to kind of recap where we've been here, the first thing we did is that we looked at the way the data is laid out, right? We had the inventory document information, and we had all the line details, whether there was adjustment in consumption, in sales and pending bills. I haven't discussed consumption yet, but that's coming in the second part of this. Okay? This is how your data is organized. And what we also found out is that the forecast quantity is really a combination of open sales orders and open purchase orders. Right? Just made it easier to bucket. And then the forecast date is a combination of the expected date in a purchase order and the ship date in a purchase order. Right? We just kind of simplified this mechanism for you. And then lastly, what we learned that we could do is that because of this document forecast type field, we could in an instant look at what's on hand, but also look at the details for a particular purchase order and a sales order. And again, just an easier way of looking at what's due for a particular item, right? It's an easier eyeball glance. You can't do that in QuickBooks because QuickBooks is either summary or detail. And the great thing about Pivot Table is that you hide all the details about the history and what's on hand because it's all rolled up to say this is our current quantity on hand. All right? Okay, that's a mouthful. Okay, let's move on to the second type here. Let's move on to where we do a little forecasting, right? Because that's a little more involved here. Okay. So again, if I were to have a picture, let's get rid of most of this here. Forecast quantity, I'll leave in there. I'm going to get rid of this weekend date out of the slicer just to kind of simplify things here. One last thing I forgot to mention up here. You notice I had these filters. You notice I had the current PO status and the current sales order status. This is kind of an important point. I shouldn't have glossed over this. It is important that if you want both the open purchase orders and the sales orders to show, that you have the open and the NA, right? Not applicable. Remember we had the date for 1980? Right? If it was a purchase order, it had an expected date, of 1/3/1980 because there is no expected date on a sales order. Same for the status on a purchase order, right? There is no sales order status on a purchase order, so it's really non-applicable. So you notice that you need to have both of these checked off, right? Sales order needs both of those, and conversely on the purchase order, it also needs to have open, and the NA here refers to the sales orders that don't have a purchase order status, right? You have to account for it somehow. Right? It doesn't exist out of thin air. Sales order doesn't have a purchase order attribute, and a purchase order doesn't have a sales order attribute. So those two have to be checked. Okay. Where was I? Okay. So for the moment, I want to take out the document reference number out of here, and I'm going to take out the forecast type. I just want to deal with what's on hand, so to speak here. I'll leave the forecast. I'll leave the forecast quantity. Let's keep this simple at this particular point here. So what we want to do is we want to be able to order, right? We want to figure out what it is that we have to order. Well, what kind of pieces come into play here? So typically in this one, as I had on the slide, you've got a sales or consumption history. Now, what's the difference between the two? Well, if you'll notice in Cube here, we actually have something that is called consumption quantity. And consumption quantity is both the sales and the items that you built within an assembly, right? That's what you consumed, okay, during that particular time. So let's see how this might pan out here, because it's different, it's different than sales, doesn't consume that. Let's see what the consumption quantity is in terms of the document types here. Might make it easier to look at. So these are things that have actually gone. Now, for a lot of people, their completed bills actually occur. Now, remember, completed bills are all the pieces that are underneath it, right? You sell on the invoice the completed assembly, but the pieces underneath it aren't sold. They're consumed. So the invoice may show these have been sold, but these hinges were consumed within an assembly and I could show you how to get that. It's kind of beyond the scope of today for the moment. But again, just I want you to differentiate between consumption and sales. Now, for most people, they do consumption, they do a build right before they do the sale. That's not true for all businesses. Some businesses do consumption. They may do inventory bills every week, every 2 weeks. They all have their own methods. So you really have to talk with your client as to what it is they want to see historically. Is it sales or is it consumption? Could be a difference. All right. All right, so that's the first thing you tend to look at. Excuse me, it's doing an auto recovery here. Then we have an on hand, right? You have to know what's on hand next. And I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to put, let's do it this way. Sales, con, hist. All right. I want to do this column by column because it's really easier to do. Then you have some type of history. Now, this sales and consumption history could be by quarter, it could be month, it could be an average of 12 months, it could be 6 months, it could be a rolling value of some type. There is no method. You might have 12 columns, okay, instead of just one column. I'm simplifying here, okay? Then what you have to do is you have to add your PO, right? And then you have to subtract your PO. And then you have to subtract your pending bills, right? Because at some point they're going to get built. And now if you do a calculation, right, you're going to take your on hand and do these calculations. You have what we call an effective availability. Now, I'm simplifying this today because you really have to consider, the availability as of when. Because we're going to talk about months on hand. You can go, well, what if it's not going to be available for 2 months? My months on hand is really not an accurate figure. I'm not trying to get to that detail. I'm just trying to show you something simple here, okay? And then you come up with something and you say, well, what is my monthly average sales? Now, it could be average weekly. Some people, they want to know how much weekly inventory they have on hand. Others say, I want to know my average monthly. I'm using monthly to just keep it simple here. So month average. And then there's generally a multiplier. Now, what you're going to notice, what I've done in this example, we're doing this example today, is then I went to the item list and I created a custom field. Because each item can have its own multiplier. This is generally how you put the multiplier in here. This is how you would deal with, because remember, you're pulling data out of QuickBooks. You don't have an interactive mentality here. And again, you're trying to be more like Henry Ford in getting out of the manual portion of this. So you put your multipliers, and of course, the great thing about QuickBooks in your list items is that you can add and edit multiple items here, right? So you actually can put your multiplier in, a lot easier than do one at a time, right? This allows you to do masses at the same time. So that's how I would approach that with a multiplier. So generally you would take that multiplier and you times that times the average month sales, right? That probably would be your next column. And this really is what we call a theoretical monthly needed, right? In other words, this is my multiplier in sales. I know that I have to have at least that amount of inventory on hand to cover that month, right? Because we know this is what we anticipate going to be consumed or sold. Okay. And then we have another multiplier, and this is generally how many months of stock do I want to have on hand? It could be weeks again, but you might have another multiplier. Again, you might do that in QuickBooks because it might be different for each item that you have. So we're going to take this theoretical times month desired multiplier. So if your average sales here were let's say it was just 10,000 with that's including the multiplier, and you actually say, well, I need to always have 2 or 3 months on hand, then you need to have 30,000, right, on hand, theoretically, right? You're saying, look, I got to have this much on hand. This is how we manage our inventory. Again, I'm simplifying here, okay? And then you're going to take this quantity on hand. If you had 20,000 on hand, right, then you're going to take this figure and you're going to subtract this figure. And this tells you kind of what do we need to order, right? This is a need to order field. Now, again, it's not all this simple, but again, typically this is how people would do this. So again, to recap, you have some sort of history, you have your on hand, and then you've got your calculations because you got to add your POs, subtract your, this should have been subtract sales order, excuse me. These are your pending bills, and this becomes your effective availability. You have a monthly average based upon your history. You have a multiplier because you say, well, our sales are going to increase or decrease. This is what an average month is to be expected. You say, how much do I want to have on hand at any one time? And that tells me what I need to order, because currently my effective availability, let's say that I had 100, I had 100 on sales order. I'm being lazy here on this one. And again, my effective availability was 20,000. My need to order should have been desired on hand minus my effective availability. Right. Sales, historically, on hand. What's in the pipeline? What is the net result? What is our average? How many monthly average do we have? Do we need to have? How many months of that do we need to have? And then that tells us what we need to order. Okay. Yeah, so I would add the PO and subtract the sales order. So in there. Sorry, I've been on a roll here and I forgot to do that. So consumption quantity sales plus consumed on bills. Yes, Matthew, that was correct. Okay. The file, we had put it in the chat. I don't know why this doesn't show. And my apologies if this didn't get to you all here. Okay. All right. Final half hour. Now this is, if your eyes are still open here, if you're able to keep up with this, now we're going to actually perform some of this. Okay. So I'm going to get rid of this consumption quantity. Just a way to, again, let's get back to simplification here. All right, so we know we have R in hand, and we know we have this forecast quantity. And just, I know we should have pending bills in here. And just for today's example, I'm going to keep it out, just to simplify it, okay? Have enough things on our plate. We're just going to deal with these two at the moment, okay? We need to have, first we need to figure out, we wanted to know what our typical sales were, right? Let's take this document type out of here. We want to know what sales were. So we know that in a Powerpivot, we have the ability to do a measure, right? A measure is something that we've created, and we're going to look at a particular sales history. So again, this is the formula mechanism that Powerpivot uses to be able to do your calculations, right? You don't ever do anything outside of your pivot table, because pivot table is dynamic. So whatever you put here that references this cell, as soon as this information is not in this cell, your information is inaccurate, right? So you're always doing a new measure, always, okay? So the dreaded table name that I stay away from, we want this measure to be within the inventory details, right, within the factual information. And we're going to call this sales history. And again, I'm oversimplifying on purpose here. And we want to look at sales for, say, 2 months in 2015. Okay. And what I've done is that I've got this for you here. I'm going to post this. All right. That's the actual formula that we're going to use. In here, you get the ability. Remember, calculate is your friend. Calculate is the one thing that you're going to do 90% of inside a Power Pivot table, because calculate allows you to do an if statement. And if you may remember from the last couple of weeks, I've said you cannot do an if statement in a regular pivot table. Okay? There's no such thing. You can't refer to a cell and say, if the cell says X, Y, and Z, give me results. In a Power Pivot, calculate gives you that ability. So you're going to do calculate, and what you do is, we know this is inventory details. I just type in the letter I, and it brings up a list of all the fields that are available to me. Now, notice that I'm not going to click on inventory sales amount. I really need to get the sum of the inventory sales amount. So let's cancel this for a second, because I want to do this the easy way for you. Let's take the sales quantity, if you can find it here. This is line sales quantity. And I want you to drag that into the values area here. I'm doing this for a reason. It's going to make you easier to create your measure formulas. So now you go into your new measure. So we have history. And we're going to put in, we want the calculate formula, because the calculate allows us to do an if statement. If you can see this, a calculate said, I want to calculate a particular line in piece of information, and I have filters that I'm going to apply to this. All right. And in what I posted to you, if I'm going to, let's do this in a, let's make this larger so you can see this here. Calculate is your formula that allows you to do an if statement. It says, I want to calculate the sales quantity. And there's a function here in Excel that says dates between. And this is my filter. I want to filter that quantity, dates between, the transaction date. This is my beginning date. This is my ending date. If I were doing 1 month, this might be a little easier to digest. And again, I'll paste this over here. This is a different type. This says, I want to calculate the sales quantity. My first filter is that I want month number equals to 12. And my second filter is I want the year number equal to 2015. Now that would just be for 1 month. Right? But in this case, we're going to do a 2-month average, so to speak. Okay. So let's just take this and paste this into the, let's just do the easy way. I'm going to paste this in. And you notice this says sum of. Let's go back here again. This says sum of. Right? Because everything in a pivot table is automatically a sum. You saw me drag this quantity in here because that way the field is automatically available. If I were to do this again by hand, equals, I got calculate, I type I for inventory details. If I go all the way down to the bottom, you'll see that it has this already done for me. Okay? And you always want to make sure that the sum of, this is a really, really important point. Okay. All right, let's get lazy. We're going to put this in here. You can click on the check formula, and then you get to put this as a number. Use the thousand separator. And I have decimal number 2 here if you want. Just depends. Inventory in QuickBooks, right, quantity is 5 decimal places. Let's just keep it simple today. Let's just make it 0. So I just need a whole number for today. So this sales history, this tells me what was sold during those 2 months, right? Then the next thing that we look to in here is that we want it to have this effective availability, right? So that's pretty simple. And if you want, you can remove the sales quantity. You don't need it anymore. I just did it to make your life a little bit easier. So we want effective. So again, go to the new measure here. So we want effective availability. In this case, we're going to do the calculate. Again, actually, you don't even need to do the calculate because this is a simple adding one column by the other here. So what we want to do is we're going to put I for inventory, parentheses I. And we're going to look for the sum of the line inventory quantity. And all we're going to do is subtract the forecast quantity because the forecast quantity automatically contains the sales orders and the purchase orders, right? So we don't need to do both columns in there. So let's go I for inventory, subtract out the forecast quantity. Check our formula, there's no errors here. Number, let's do whole number. So this is your effective availability. Right. Now, the next column that we wanted to create, we had the effective availability. We wanted the month average, right? So what we wanted to do is take the sales history and divide by 2, right? So let's do this. So let's do average monthly. We don't need to do the calculate. This is a simple calculation, right? So what we want to do is we want to look for, again, you can go to the I. And let's see, where are we here? There's a sales history, and divide by 2. Right? Check your phone. We know we had 2 months in there. Now, again, that could be a variable, right? Again, depending on what you put in there. Again, I'm trying to be simple here. Let's just do a whole number. So that's kind of our average monthly sales, right? We can just see it just took it and we rounded it off, right? It might have, you know, in this case here, might want to right click. Actually, I can just go to this measure. Let's go to this average monthly. If I click on this, you'll see that I have measure settings available. Let's change this to decimal number. Let's just do 1 decimal place. So now we have average monthly. So the next thing that we on our list, and you know, we do this when we're doing, you know, even custom reports or solution providers. This is what we do. We actually go this column by column, just like we're doing here. Right? You lay it out, figure out what's going to be done. You just take it one at a time. Now in this case here, we have a multiplier. We have to take that multiplier and multiply it times the average so we can get a true expected monthly average. Now that's a custom field, right? We created a custom field in QuickBooks. But what we have to do first is that we have to make it work like a number. So we have to go into a Powerpivot window here. And you're going to say, well, how do I know what custom field this is? Well, actually, if you had Cube, it would tell you. They come out alphabetically. That's the easiest way to describe this. We have some lookups. And we have this thing called custom fields listing. And you can see here are our item custom fields. And you see this multiplier, if I extend this out, its label is custom field 4. And you're wondering why, because they come out, the QuickBooks data comes out alphabetically for custom fields. Okay. So Matthew, you certainly could. A moving monthly total, you certainly could do that. There's no limit to the calculations you can do because of what Powerpivot makes available to you. Okay. You can set up any type of calculation. And again, people will do like a rolling 6 months, so you can do a formula to say the last number of days or the last 6 months. Okay. That is available to do that. Okay. So you have the item custom field. We know in this case it's number 4. So we're going to go over to the item tab over here. And this lists all the fields that are available for item. And you'll notice over here that we've got, here's our custom fields. And if we scroll down, we see that I've put in some multipliers here. But the problem is that this comes out as text. Right now this is text. If you'll see up here, it says data type is text. And again, even though you format something in QuickBooks to be a number, it's still stored underneath the hood as text, and that's how it comes out to us. Right? So now I want you to change this data type text and change this to a decimal number. And now you see that they're right justified, right, for a number, and you see the format is now general. You can change that to decimal number. And these down here to work just like Excel, right? You could give this a number of, right? You could change this to 1 decimal places or 2. And I'm just clicking on these items here. Right? These are just shortcuts. Now, if you get an error when you do something like this, it means that you've got something that doesn't look like a number, and it can't convert it to a number. So what you would have to do is scroll through your list to see if you had something that maybe was a result of an earlier entry into a custom field. Maybe you changed the type of the custom field. Okay. But in order for this to be converted to a number, it has to look and act like a number, right? All right, let's close this. And you'll see that there's a yellow warning. It says the Powerpivot data was modified. We're going to refresh here. Okay. So now we should be able to take that field and we're going to multiply it, right? The multiplier. So let's create a new measure in here. Let's go back to Powerpivot. Let's do a new measure. And what we want to do is we're going to put I in this tab, and we're going to do IT for item. We have custom field here. Then we're going to multiply this times I for inventory details. We want to multiply this times the, it's at the top here, times the average monthly. Yep. Because it's the wrong field. It should have been 4. It still doesn't like it. I didn't test this before I did this. I should have done this here. Average monthly. This really should be an average. I want to do something here. I want to cancel that just for 1 second. I want you to bring that item in here. And there's a reason to do it. Remember I told you always had to have a sum of some particular type. I want you to bring this item custom field into the values area. Okay. And you can see that it comes in. I should be able to do this now. And this, instead of a sum, if you edit this measure, this really should be average. Right? So if you're doing a rate or something of that nature, it's always going to be an average. It's not going to be a sum. All right, let's go back to our measure again. And let's take this, and this is going to be our multiplier equals, I got item, item, average custom field times I for inventory details times the average monthly. Now we have no errors. Let's go to number on this one. I use 2 here. So now you see that it's given us a multiplier, right? Our average monthly was 13. A multiplier is 1.15. So now this is what we're supposed to have on hand, right, for a particular month. So we have 2 calculations left to get us to our deal, right? We follow our little design here, our scope sheet as I call it. We want to see how many months we want to have on hand. So this is what we should have on hand for a particular month. Let's create a new measure. And we're going to say desired stock level. And again, just another simple calculation. Let's say that we want to keep 3 months on hand. I'm just going to throw something out there, okay? So you can just take your inventory. What do we call that? We called it multiplier. So it's going to be down here. Here's our multiplier times, let's say, 3 months on hand. Number, decimal number, this one here. So that means we really want to have 44.9 available, right? And now our last calculation here is we want to say what do we need to order based upon this is what I want, okay, but this is what I have available. So again, we'll create our last calculation. I want to put this under the inventory details, and we're going to call this need to order. And now we're going to take our I. This is our desired stock level minus I for our effective availability. And what we want to do is that we want to, let's change this on here. Let's do value field settings. Number format, and maybe you want to do something custom here. Maybe if it's negative, make it red, right? So in this instance, that would say if anything is positive, this tells us what we need to order. If it's negative, it means we're way overstocked, and now you have to do another Powerpivot to figure out, analyze your inventory turnover, which is a subject for another day. Okay, we made it through all this. Man, I can't believe it. That's a lot of information, people. I appreciate your hanging in there. So now this is overly simplified, but it shows you what you can do with just Excel, the tools we're given with, to be able to forecast or to see when items are due. And in this case, I actually, let's go back here a second. Let's go back to current slide. No, it's not what I wanted. Whoop, excuse me. Get there in a second. Okay. All right. So that was the last one this is the first one we did, right? We looked at when something was due. You could put it in a bucket. And then we did kind of the reorder information in terms of, how to create a simple report analysis, as it were. And then we looked at the secondary in terms of the, we looked at the serial lot or custom fields, item and agent vendor. So I want to highlight the kind of these last two items, and this is our next slide, and then we'll have to group. So group items is one of those things that you can do in QuickBooks, but you can't report on, right? You can't even report on that in QuickBooks. Cube is really no different in an aspect because a group changes dynamically, right? And it often includes inventory, non-inventory. So that's why you can't do it. Now, having said that, we are actually able to do something like that if something is consistent, but it's something that's completely customizable. It's highly customizable, I should say. Inventory multipliers are things that we tend to keep, as I show you, keep in a custom field. I think that's the best way to do it. Now, let's show what QuickBooks exposes and what it doesn't. I will do this rather quickly. In a typical inventory program, okay, let's say that we have item A, and this is true for any accounting program that keeps track of inventory. What they do is that you say you have a bill and you purchase 5 of these, and instead of putting 5 as a total in there, it actually would have quantity 1, quantity 1, quantity 1, quantity 1, quantity 1. And what it would do is it would assign a number to this, right? So underneath the hood, this might have number 1001, 1002, 1003. And what that does, it allows you to track the history of an item, right? Literally. But QuickBooks doesn't expose that, right? Even for the FIFO that it puts in there. It doesn't expose that. And it becomes problematic. So the reverse engineering we do is limited in that aspect, okay? So a lot of times people will say, I would like to know my history by a particular vendor. We really can't do that. We can do it by preferred vendor, but that means, there would be only one vendor involved. And for a lot of people, one vendor is okay. You have multiple vendors, you just don't have a way to do it. The other piece to that is that you want to be able to do something by aging. You say, how old is something? Now, the only way we can do that is with a lot number or even a serial number to that degree, because we know the first time it was brought in, right? But you can't do it to say, well, when was this item brought in? Because, again, we don't have that unique number assigned to that particular item, okay? And then people will do all sorts of things. They go, well, couldn't you do this, couldn't do that. Just forget it. Can't do it. You need to have the lot numbers and serial numbers to be able to track that type of thing, okay? And again, that's when I discuss the vendors or the preferred vendor here. All right. That's enough. That's enough. Do we have any burning questions in here, having covered all that? A lot of information. Hi, Linda. Can you turn on filters for column heading? Yeah, so Linda, actually that's a good question. No, you never want to filter on something, because if you filter on a column, what's it going to do? It's going to filter out everything, so your information is right. So remember, I don't know if you had this need to order. Remember we had this thing called the KPI? So you might want to create something here. And it figures, why doesn't, oh, because I'm on the need to order. Let's see here. You might want to put, I don't know exactly how you would do this, but because that's not target measure, great. It's not even. So saying the base measure. I have to get back to you. I know there's a way to do this. You caught me off guard on that one. I will answer you later. I will answer you offline. I will send the answer to that. That's what this is for. I can do it with percentages. I just have never tried it with the need to order. This should be a fairly easy thing to do, you would think. But I think Yeah, I'll have to get back to you. I just don't know. I don't know everything. Bin location. Yes, Hayden, we have bin location. So we have site and we have bin location, and that's only in 2013 that we have that. Hayden Turner is one of our solution providers here. He's got a company called WingDisk. This guy does some really, really advanced stuff. People need help. He's the guy to go to. Smart man. Glad you're here, Hayden. Yeah, actually, Hayden, I'll show you. We actually, you'll see that we have bin location up here. So if I were to put, I could do this like this. I could put site name in the item here. And then underneath that, I could put the bin location name. Whoops. All right. So Matthew, I will post that. Something I can't do here because it might take me a little bit. If you email me offline, I'll be happy to help you with that. Something we probably need to post in our community anyway. Also, in terms of information that is available, one of the things that you can probably do, I'm going to show you this last piece here. Trying to find Powerpivot blog. Oh, dread it, dread it, dread it. Well, there was one that I wanted to get you. Bear with me 1 second. Let me find this for you. So I do want to get you this information. It is very helpful. Oh, okay. PowerPivotinfo.com. Okay, here it is. So this one here is, this guy is probably king. He actually worked at Microsoft and just has all kinds of information about Powerpivot, how to do formulas. You can do some really expensive stuff, expansive, not expensive, but expansive things. The language inside Powerpivot is extremely powerful. You can also go to Mr. Excel. Mr. Excel has a lot of books and information on the subject here. Bill Jellin, he's been around for a long time, and he actually, you can see he actually partners with us. So these are your two top information. I tell you what, let me post this in your questions here. So you have that. Okay, folks, we're at the end. No other burning questions. I appreciate you making it through this here.